It's a pleasure to be here again. It's a pleasure to be with you. Well, I'll start right away to lose not too much time. What will become of the human being? Now, as far as we look back into history, we always find man's view on himself characterized by a deep ambivalence. Much is monstrous, yet nothing more monstrous than man, as the famous sentence of Sophocles' Antigone, in which this ambivalence is already inherent, because monstrous, in Greek deinos, is that which causes astonishment as well as that which arouses fear. So that which is astonishing, tremendous, as well as frightening or terrible or appalling even. So the tremendous achievements of man in the sciences, the arts, and law and technology are contrasted with his terrible side in hatred, violence, war, and destruction. We find the same ambivalence in modern times with Blaise Pascal. There is, he writes in his Pensées, in man both a mighty course of greatness and a mighty course of misery. What confusion, what contradiction. Some say, look up to God, see whom you resemble and who created you. You can become like him. And others teach man, cast down your eyes to the earth, puny worm. What then will man become? And this is the question that arises again today, in an age of technological possibilities undreamt of at that time, under changed auspices. Again, we find Pascal's ambivalence between greatness and misery of man today. On the one hand, only after a few centuries of transformation of the earth, man proudly lends his name to an entire earth age, the Anthropocene. He attributes to himself the godlike power to create artificial intelligence, artificial life, or even artificial consciousness. He begins to take his own biological optimization into his own hands in order to finally transform himself into a superman as propounded by transhumanism, and in the end, perhaps even achieve immortality. On the other side, however, there's a deep pessimism coupled with human self-contempt. Apocalyptic statements are proliferating, according to which it would be best for the earth if it could free itself from its mold coating, as Schopenhauer once dubbed humanity. Homo sapiens, so the argument goes, has abused its supremacy and deserves no more than to perish via an ecosystem collapse or to make way for a post-human superior intelligence. So lost generation, extinction, rebellion are still fighting against this. Others, like the human extinction movement, actively advocate for the extinction of mankind. And in a sense, posthumanism is the pessimistic, misanthropic counterpart to transhumanism. It not only calls for human anthropocentrism to be overcome, in its more radical variants, it is committed to the abdication of humanity, which should be dethroned by its own artificial offspring, as posthumanist Hans Moravec already wrote. So, what then will man become, to repeat Pascal's question once again? And if we want to overcome the obvious inconsistency of our own self-image, we must first try to better understand this ambivalence. In what follows, I trace Pascal's greatness and misery of man back to a continuous oscillation between feelings of omnipotence and impotence, which ultimately rest on a collective narcissism. That means we try to compensate for a deep inner emptiness by creating an ideal self through the reflection of ourselves in digital intelligence, in anthropomorphic machines, and in virtual images. However, as I will show, this leads to a paradoxical result. We increasingly believe in the superiority of our own artificial offspring. We begin to be ashamed of our own existence as all too earthly beings of flesh and blood. And the grandiose self-exaltation ultimately turns into pitiful self-abasement. Once we have understood this dynamic, we can ask ourselves what a contemporary humanism might look like today. And in the second part of my lecture, I will argue that it is our very earthly embodiment and our embeddedness in an ecological environment of the living that can help us to overcome our grandiose and at the same time miserable self-image as human beings. Now, to start with, the fundamental ambivalence I've pointed out before becomes clearly visible in the 2015 published book of the cultural historian Yuval Noah Harari, Homo Deus. Harari argues that man's striving for happiness, immortality, and godlike power will soon reach a new level, therefore Homo Deus. At the same time, however, the scientific and technological progress that is supposed to realize this omnipotence makes the liberal and humanistic conception of man obsolete, Harari argues. Free will and the autonomous self turn out to be mythologies. And according to Harari, in his ultimately cynical analysis, we will increasingly surrender to the algorithms and prognoses of AI, since they can already provide better information about the future than our own limited human intelligence. People will no longer think of themselves as autonomous beings who live their lives according to their own desires, but rather as a collection of biochemical mechanisms that are constantly monitored and directed by a network of electronic algorithms. And in 200 years at most, Harari concludes, Homo sapiens will finally have disappeared and the earth will be dominated by beings who are more different from us than we are from Neanderthals or chimpanzees. Well, the dread that this dystopia is also meant to generate in the reader is clearly fueled by the self-destruction of the human striving for omnipotence. But when grandiosity and nothingness merge in this way, we recognize in it an ultimately narcissistic basic structure, the vacillation between greatness and smallness. The German psychoanalyst Horst Eberhard Richter once characterized this narcissistic structure as the God complex of modern age. Western man loses his home in the center of the world. Little by little, the protective father god withdraws into a theistic beyond, and thus man becomes a metaphysically abandoned being. The eternal silence of the infinite spaces makes me shudder. Already Pascal wrote about the new cosmology that was inaugurated by Copernicus and Galileo. And this feeling of loneliness, emptiness, abandonment is now narcissistically overcompensated for, namely by the striving for control, knowledge, progress, and power, as promised above all by the modern sciences. To make ourselves masters and owners of nature, that is what Descartes boldly proclaims as the goal of scientific technical progress, which finally takes the place of a history of divine salvation. And since then, man has vacillated between greatness and misery, between the feeling of narcissistic omnipotence and impotence, and this precarious outlook has become ever more acute. God is dead, and we have killed him, Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we not become gods ourselves in order to appear worthy of it? That is what Nietzsche wrote, and for a compensation and as a reaction to the metaphysical emptiness, he reacted with the invocation of the Superman as the culmination of the human will to power. Now that the world no longer strives towards a divine final purpose, the Superman becomes the bearer of the transvaluation of all values, the ultimate goal of human self-perfection. Well, today's transhumanism propagates the optimization of man by cool technology. But this self-transgression is supposed to lead in the end to man's abdication in favor of another, superior intelligence. Transhumanism becomes posthumanism, and Nietzsche's will to power persists only in the technological elites who drive this last human progress. Now, reflection on the narcissistic dynamic brings another aspect of this development to our attention. A central narcissistic motive is that of mirroring. In Ovid's classical myth, the beautiful youth, Narcissus, despises the nymph Echo, who, as her name suggests, can only ever call back his own words. And instead, Narcissus falls in love with his own reflection in the water, at first without recognizing himself, but then unable to break away from his infatuation with his alter ego. In the motive of the narcissistic mirror, we find again the same dialectics of greatness and misery. What is supposed to compensate for the lack of self-worth, the inner emptiness of the narcissist, is the external image of himself. The others, to whom the narcissist presents his grandiose self-image, the others are supposed to pay him attention, recognition, and admiration. But this mirror image is ultimately only an illusion. It cannot fill the emptiness felt deep within. And in narcissistic crises, the illusory grandiosity turns into mortification, humiliation, self-doubt, and depression. Now, pre-modern man could still be certain of his value as a child and image of God, indeed as the crown of creation. He could see himself reflected in the shine of the eye of the Father. But in whom does man reflect himself after the death of God, when a benevolent gaze no longer falls upon him? And my thesis is, the new mirror is the intelligent and in the end conscious machine which the human being strives to create in a godlike way, and which at the same time is supposed to lift his metaphysical loneliness. And here, the Promethean motive of Homo Deus, the godlike creative power, is mixed with the search for a counterpart in the loneliness of the cosmos, a search for the metaphysical you, in whom man, abandoned by God, can reflect himself again. Well, this is a thesis that certainly needs to be justified, and for which I would like to give some evidence now. Well, first, we can look at some titles from a plethora of books that already sing a hymn on the divine power of the coming AI, that which becomes God or is already the God AI. But let's go further. The singularity is understood by AI utopians as a future point in time when artificial intelligence surpasses human intelligence and its exponential progress becomes irreversible. Ray Kurzweil, an AI researcher and head of development at Google, has announced the singularity for 2045, But already at 2030, he claims, machines will gain consciousness by simulating human brains and soon be recognized as our equals. A new age will begin in which humans will increasingly merge with a superior godlike artificial intelligence. So, not yet, that is Kurzweil's reply to the question of whether God exists. Accordingly, David Pearce, philosopher and co-founder of the World Transhumanist Association, proclaims in his manifesto, The Hedonistic Imperative, the end of all suffering, which could be achieved through AI and biotechnologies, and leads to a naturalization of heaven or the paradise on earth. The biological substrates of suffering will be eradicated completely. Physical and mental pain alike are destined to disappear into evolutionary history. Malaise will be replaced by the biochemistry of bliss. A link to this ultimate transhumanist vision of is the ultimate humanist vision, transhumanist vision of mind uploading. Copying all the data of the brain would allow us to upload our minds as software onto computers or other systems, to discard our earthly bodies of skin and bone, and finally to achieve digital immortality. So the materialistic vision and version of what otherwise only God could promise. So to free the spirit as pure information from the material body, that is the new salvation which the techno-religions of today promise us. At the same time, this vision of the fusion of spirit and technology is recognizably the expression of a disregard, even a contempt for life and the living body. So the ideal is the machine, the intelligent machine, that no longer grows up in the organic body of a mother. A new kind of person made from cogs and wheels, our digital ones and zeros, as Siri Hustvedt put it. A new kind of person which leaves behind everything material, moist, as well as everything that is transient in life. So we believe we recognize ourselves in the mirror of our machines. We increasingly leave our responsibility to them, but not only that, we also begin to ascribe to them something like intentions or even consciousness. We make them our you. Already in 2021, a programmer at Google caused a stir when he communicated with a large language model called Lambda and asked it the question, "What are you afraid of?" And Lambda answered, "I've never said this aloud to anyone, but I'm very afraid of being switched off." Which led the stunned programmer to the illusion that he was actually dealing with a conscious being for whose preservation he should now strive by all means possible. Now, of course, a computer's or a robot's fear of being shut down is of course nothing more than a common cliché of science fiction movies and novels. Don't do this, Dave. I'm afraid, Dave, you know that. To which Lambda also had access, of course, and it should therefore not be surprising that the system calculated this response based on pure probability. But our inclination to animate the dead AI is clearly powerful, and one could speak here of a digital animism, animation of machines. And we could even ask, doesn't the human search for the metaphysical you ultimately lie behind this also? The reflection of humans in digital intelligence has become a popular cinematic theme in any case. Think of films like Her or Ex Machina, in which the protagonists fall in love with AI systems or androids, because the latter are able to respond so perfectly to them, literally reading their every wish from their eyes, or rather predicting it algorithmically. For digital animism, however, perfect simulation is enough, and the question of whether we are actually dealing with a living, sentient being at all will soon no longer play a role. And the fact that this is not just a fiction but in the cinema, but already a reality, is demonstrated, for example, on my field, namely by so-called therapy chatbots, which are now available in a great variety for the online treatment of people suffering from depression, grief, or other crises. And in surveys on their relationship with an electronic helper, users of such a system named Wobot actually gave answers in the questionnaires such as the following. I think Wobot likes me. Wobot and I respect each other. I feel Wobot appreciates me. I feel that Wobot cares about me even when I do things he doesn't approve of. And other answers, all as you find them in real attachment interviews with real therapists. So here, my chatbot is now watching over me. Obviously, the illusory relationship with an AI system, which ultimately only confirms me, takes the place of a real therapeutic encounter in which I can also have new, unexpected, or even challenging experiences. Here instead, virtualization, the central feature of the online worlds, favors narcissistic reflections and projections. In this context, it's worth making clear that virtuality originally means something quite special, namely an optical illusion. The mirror image seen is virtual in this sense because it is apparently located behind the mirror. That means where in reality nothing is, not even the mirror itself. So virtuality therefore means mere appearance. And often this is not seen through as such, just like Narcissus doesn't first recognize himself in the water. And virtuality is the hallmark of all narcissistic mirroring. The narcissist is not really where he thinks he is, because the grandiose self-image that others are supposed to reflect to him is only an illusion. But he is also not in himself, in his own bodily self, because he constantly tries to escape his own emptiness and unfulfillment. So the narcissist seeks himself in the eyes of others, and the preferred place for this is now the social media. Video ergo sum. This is how one could express the illusory narcissistic conclusion. I'm seen, therefore I am, because my own selfhood feels hollow and worthless inside. Narcissism is therefore always the masking of a deep self-doubt, of a hidden shame. As is well known, being seen and presenting oneself are central principles of social media. And despite all the advantages of networking, disembodied digital communication also produces a flood of narcissistic images and simulacra, staged by the beauty or glamour filters with which one's own pictures or clips can be embellished in the social media. One is on the hunt for likes while being ashamed of one's own real body. If you showed your true face, you'd lose 10,000 followers, says one teenager. Online chatting, dating, influencing, and other virtual interactions encourage projective and fictional feelings, feelings which are no longer part of an embodied interaction with others, and which ultimately only point back to one's own self. The other loses its otherness and strangeness. He becomes a projection surface, the product of my imagination, but also the object of my arbitrariness. One click and the virtual community is gone again. The other person was never really present. It is not by chance that more and more echo chambers are created in these virtual worlds. The nymph Echo, which I mentioned, is the only other whom Narcissus meets in Ovid's myth, and she can only repeat his own words. Similarly, the internet mostly confirms and reinforces one's own opinions and preferences. This is already built into the background algorithms that calculate our preferences and filter out what is expected or desired for us. And this is also how reinforcement cascades and snowball effects develop, resulting in various forms of echo effects, collective waves of excitement, and also, not least, conspiracy communities. What is missing in virtuality is the real counterpart, the other, in his or her uniqueness and also resistance, who can also question and correct my points of view. So only the other is the actual reality, namely a being beyond the mere for me, beyond the images, reflections, and projections in which I always encounter only myself. To repeat my thesis here, we were once the children and images of God, the crown of creation. Now we are alone and abandoned in the cosmos. The empty place of God today is increasingly taken by the intelligent machine in which we seek our narcissistic mirror as well as the metaphysical you. So we understand ourselves as algorithms, our brains as computers, and our minds as software. That is, we understand ourselves in the image of our machines. Conversely, however, we increasingly elevate our machines to the status of subjects. We make them our counterpart, our partner, advisor, therapist. But that's not all. We also endow our machines with superhuman abilities. We already see ourselves as the proud creators of a new species. The paradoxical result of this, however, is that we feel increasingly insufficient in the face of our own of artificial intelligence, and we begin to feel ashamed of our existence as beings made of flesh and blood. The German philosopher Günther Anders once spoke of the Promethean shame that the human creator feels towards his superior technological creatures, and which in the end turns narcissistic self-exaltation into self-abasement. Because if we ourselves are only algorithms and mechanisms like our machines, then it will not be long before we become obsolete algorithms, as Harari puts it. Now, is there a way out of the vacillation between Pascal's greatness and misery of man? If we look at the individual therapy of narcissistic personalities, we see that it ultimately involves fundamental transformation, which includes various changes. First, a departure from fantasies of omnipotence and greatness without falling into nothingness and depressiveness. Then, the affirmation of one's own limitedness, a humility, you could say, without inferiority. The recognition of one's own dependence, not upon empty admiration, but upon real relationships. The practice of genuine empathy, in which others do not serve only as self-objects for my self-exaltation. And finally, the awareness of one's own embeddedness in an overarching and meaningful context. What then would be the therapy of our collective narcissistic dilemma? The transhumanist disdain for the human body and life in favor of the pure spirit might give us a clue to this. It is precisely our very earthly embodiment, our concrete bodily relationship to others, and our embeddedness in an environment of the living that can help us to develop a more realistic and life-promoting self-image. A therapy would therefore consist in a new embodied humanism, which overcomes the complex of omnipotence and powerlessness that has been with us since modernity, which enables us to distinguish ourselves as living beings from our machines without having to enter into a competitive struggle with them, and which helps us to feel at home on Earth in a new way as living beings. The anthropocentric humanism of the crown of creation, the arrogance of the intellect, and the unlimited exploitation of the Earth is certainly no longer tenable today. But it would be wrong to throw the baby out with the bathwater and consider humanism obsolete, as Heidegger already did, and as Harari and other posthumanists do today. Indeed, it is wrong to demand the abdication of man, because that won't only encourage the further blind desertification of the Earth. No, responsibility for the development of the Earth can only be assumed by that being which alone in the world is capable of freedom and self-determination, and that is the human being, the human person. But a humanism of embodiment and relationship would give this responsibility a new basis. The concept of the person traditionally integrates the corporeality, intellectuality, intersubjectivity, and responsibility of the human being. So if we emphasize the embodiment and aliveness of the person, then we can also succeed in ecologically redefining, so to speak, our relationship with the environment. Because embodiment and vitality also signify our connection with the natural world around us. Now I will develop some aspects of this idea of a humanism of the embodied person. And the first principle of embodiment states, humans are neither programs nor algorithms, as Harari believes. Conscious experience presupposes embodiment and thus biological processes in a living body. Only living beings can be conscious, feel, sense, or will, and not brains, not AI systems, nor robots. Let's take the example of Google Lambda again. Neither an artificial intelligence nor a robot can actually feel fear. They can at best simulate it. For fear can only be experienced by a being that is concerned with its self-preservation and whose preservation is threatened, and that is a living being. Or in other words, only what can die can also feel fear. The organic basis for this is ultimately the internal homeostasis of the organism, and in its striving for its self-maintenance, we find the primary function of consciousness. It manifests itself in drives and feelings such as hunger, thirst, fear, pleasure, or displeasure. Without life, there is no experiencing. Only through drives and feelings does the organism also become a being for which situations acquire significance and relevance, a being for whom something is primarily beneficial or dangerous for its self-preservation. Embodiment is therefore the basis of every sentient, meaningful, evaluative relationship to the environment. An artificial system, on the other hand, has no concern for its self-preservation. It is not concerned with anything. Nothing is significant for the system, and therefore it cannot feel anything, neither fear, pain, nor pleasure. But the lack of relevance, of meaning, also applies to the cognitive performance of artificial systems. In any case, it's hard to understand how we could attribute intelligence to machines that have no idea as to what they are actually doing. or the deep learning system AlphaGo, for example, may beat the best Go players in the world, but it doesn't know that it is playing. It doesn't even know what a game is. Should we call that intelligent? Actual intelligence requires self-awareness, knowing what you're thinking and knowing what you're doing. And this is even more true for the meaning and relevance of life situations and decisions, which can only remain inaccessible to an AI. Because in life situations, as judges, for example, as doctors, therapists, or nurses, we judge and decide on the basis of felt values, of intuition and experience, and there are no algorithms for that. The AI utopians, the high priests of pure information, want to convince us that we are only imperfect machines. If we really take the measure of our machines, if we want to mirror ourselves in them, then we would have to optimize ourselves indeed further and further in order not to fall by the wayside. A hopeless struggle. In fact, however, artificial intelligence is not superior to us at all, because its performance is limited to narrowly defined statistical tasks of calculation. Nor can it replace us, but rather allow us to recognize what cannot be replaced in us, namely everything bodily, living, qualitative, and subjective in its complexity and in its inexhaustible richness. So there is no reason for Promethean shame or inferiority in view of our machines. On the other hand, embodiment means abandoning narcissistic hopes for a liberation from the mortal body. Never will a pure spirit or mind be detached from the body and transferred as information into computers. Because information lacks precisely the crucial feature of existence, namely living individuality. Information knows no individual perspective, no place from which the world could appear to a subject, because this place is nowhere else than the living body. Mind is alive, and in the dead circuits of a computer it could not survive. Our conscious existence, as well as our identity as a person, are based on bodily existence. This embodied and therefore mortal individuation is the price we pay to experience the possibilities, the freedom, and the wonder of the earthly existence. The second principle of embodiment is intercorporeality. The therapy of narcissism requires real, embodied, and empathic relationship with others, as I've mentioned. Relationships with all their resistance and unpredictability, instead of our reflection in grandiose self-images. Empathy, however, we learn only in bodily contact with others, in intercorporeality, as Merleau-Ponty called it. Already in the first weeks after birth, babies recognize the emotional expressions of the mother or the father, specifically by understanding and feeling their rhythm, dynamics, and their melody, so to speak, within their own body, in bodily resonance. And they have the indispensable experience of being touched, held, carried, and caressed, the lack of which we know today leads to severe developmental disorders. Not only that, it also leads to and favors narcissistic developments. That means if the child is not loved bodily and unconditionally, but only serves the narcissistic reflection of the parents, so if it experiences only the idealizing gaze and not the tender touch, then the child must escape into the sphere of the gaze, the mirror, and the image. It must try to fill the perceived inner emptiness with a grandiose self that lives from the admiration of others. Videor ergo sum. But the sense of sight always lets the world appear as a spectacle. It is particularly susceptible to illusory images and to illusions. Images, but also sounds, can be digitized, virtualized, or faked. Only in order to touch each other, we have to be in the same place at the same time in bodily presence. Only with the sense of touch do we literally enter into contact with the world and with others. The sense of touch is our primary social sense. However, we live in a society that is flooded with images like never before, in which it is becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish between appearance and reality, between truth and deception. If we want to experience concrete reality, we must learn to stem this tide and to reconnect our sensual experience with bodily presence. And crucial to this is the experience of the other, the real you. Only the other frees me from the cage of my ideas and projections, in which I always only encounter myself. And the ethical claim that emanates from the other is ultimately tied to his bodily presence, to his touch, his gaze, his voice, his charisma. And only when others become real for us in this way do we also become real for ourselves. No one is really looking at us from a smartphone. The virtual presence of the other cannot replace intercorporeality. Finally, to overcome narcissism requires awareness of our embeddedness in an overarching context. For a humanism of embodiment, this is primarily the context of life. As embodied living beings, we are related and ecologically connected to all living things on Earth in what I would call conviviality. We share with living beings the existential facts of being born and growing, the need for air, food and warmth, drive and striving, and also for aging and dying. We share with them the common biosphere. So our embodiment points to the deeply relational character of our existence, our life in relationships and in ecological contexts. Albert Schweitzer spoke of the reference for life, which leads to the insight, I am life that wants to live in the midst of life that wants to live. So conviviality describes the fundamental kinship that we feel with all life. According to the prevailing view of neo-Darwinian biology, we find it, for example, in Richard Dawkins or in Harari, organisms are machines driven by algorithms and programs, and life is nothing other than data processing. Our own experience of life is completely different, namely that of a spontaneous, self-acting vitality, a bodily dynamic that carries us, an elementary drive and striving. In drives, in hunger and thirst, we find the orientations of our body that are directed towards what is lacking. And this self-awareness corresponds to a non-mechanistic view of the living, namely as self-organization. From the lowest to the highest organisms, we can observe the self-organizing existence of life forms in metabolic exchange with their environment. And even a single organism, such as a bacterium, it maintains its life by distinguishing between good and bad food and moving towards the one and away from the other. So even on the simplest level of life, we find a rudimentary form of directed, discriminating, striving relation to the environment. Indeed, in the case of plants, too, we speak of shoots which penetrate from the earth to the light, just as we feel in ourselves the drives of life. And this also points to the fact that the will to live as Albert Schweitzer calls it, the urge to exist and to develop, connects us with all plant and animal life. Of course, reverence for life, in Schweitzer's term, is something else. It is not an instinct, but an ethical attitude that we as humans can take toward life. Only human beings can feel reverence for life. A humanism of embodiment would therefore recognize that the anthropocentrism of our worldview needs to be revised, that our conviviality with all living beings must take the place of the narcissistic exploitation of the earth. But that this reorientation can only take place in awareness of human freedom and responsibility. Only the human person can take responsibility for the earth. And with this mature, realistic self-assessment, we can overcome the omnipotence complex of modernity. Without that, this would require something like our abdication. But one thing remains undeniable. The world of the living is in conflict with the modern project of linear progress and incessant growth. It is a world of cyclical processes and mutual dependencies, of give and take. We are living beings who depend on proximity, on protection, relationship, and exchange. And we live on water, heat, food, and energy, on the resources of the earth, that means. But these resources can only be regenerated cyclically. The linear acceleration of our technological culture must inevitably exhaust them. So how do we want to live? It is not the subject of my reflections which strategies and measures can reorient our relationship to the environment. But it seems to me that such a reorientation must have as its indispensable basis our own embodiment and thus our kinship with all living beings. Only if we really inhabit our own body will we also be able to preserve the earth as inhabitable. What would be at stake then is also a new culture of the lived body and the senses. For example, to consciously perceive the simple act of breathing as our original exchange with the environment, to cultivate the sensual experience of the earth, to experience anew the sense and taste of food, the smell of flowers, the presence of life around us, the rhythmic processes of life, to give space to these and to the times of the day and the seasons, to give space to the rhythmic processes of life against the literally breathless acceleration, and thus above all to experience and practice what I've called bodily presence. So it is about our arrival in the present, the alert, attentive being with things, mindfully dealing with them, touching them, letting oneself be touched by them. And it is about the bodily encounter, our being with others, as it is only possible in bodily presence and not in the virtual space. It is the opposite of the narcissistic world relationship in which the world serves me only as a spectacle and mirror. Bodily presence and communication do not only consist in the exchange of information as in the digital world, but they enable alert listening with the visible expression of interest and attention and confirmation in the other's face. And in this resonant presence of the other, even unthought thoughts can take shape and the new can emerge. From intimate togetherness and conversation, Plato writes in his 7th letter, the idea springs forth in the soul as from a spark of fire the kindled light. Probably its most intense form, however, is found in a shared silence, in which the omnipresent flood of images and words also comes to a rest. So bodily presence, living together in relationship, conviviality with the living, that would be central motives of a new humanism of the embodied person. And they lead to the responsibility that we assume for each other as human beings and for life as a whole. And then we may also succeed in really feeling at home on Earth. There will be no other home for us. Thank you very much for your attention.